Okay, so this presentation is about something that I call liminal samurai, like basically the blurred lines of Edo period status. So I think folks may know that like Edo period Japan, there was like kind of this delineation between like samurai and commoners, and then sometimes you'll hear things like four classes or shino kosho, which is like samurai, peasant, artisan, and merchant. So what we're going to be talking about is the dividing line between samurai and commoner, essentially, and how that line isn't really as firm as like maybe popular conception has. And yeah, I mean, without further ado, we can actually just go on to the first subject, and that is delineating between a Bushi and a samurai. Some apologies for the text window here, but the thing that we want to talk about here is that Anglophone scholarship versus like Japanese history and Japanese scholarship has a bit of difference. So in Anglophone scholarship, like what we refer to as a samurai is kind of a all-encompassing term that refers to Bushi as well as other people. So what is a Bushi in this case? The Bushi are a social status group of warriors, generally speaking. So like it's like everybody that is in this group, whereas a samurai is actually a subset. It's just these particular warriors, typically in the upper portion of a daimyo or the shogunate's retainer band. And one of the deciding factors of an upper or lower samurai is usually the right to an audience with their lord. So like an upper level samurai or like a hatamoto in the Tokugawa shogunate would have the right to receive an audience from the shogun, presumably to do something like address grievances or something like that. Like I know at least one Jidaigeki, like there was a plot in an episode where this hatamoto would go around and like harass commoners, and if they would put up a fight, the hatamoto say, well, you know, if you don't go along with what I say, I'm gonna use my right to talk to the shogun, and then you're gonna get punished or something. So like maybe that's not how it worked in real life, but like it is an indication of that sense. Yes, this is in fact an episode of Abarengo Shogun. That is literally where it comes from. Would all folks with audience privileges be considered to report directly to their lord in the modern business sense? I don't think that's the case here. I think that's I think that audience is a much more formal arrangement in this case. However, I'm not necessarily sure about the details of what the audience implies here. It is something that a lot of scholars like to point out, but don't go into detail about. So I think it makes sense just to like kind of directly quote like one of those said scholars, so Constantine Vaporis. I'm just gonna quote this at length because it's very succinct, even if it's pretty long, and it kind of shows it's not the same. The Lord doesn't directly administer them. Yeah, that's true. Like that's so yeah, we're talking about a direct, yeah, like the Lord is not the direct superior. He's kind of like the CEO. Like you don't interact with the CEO on a daily basis if you're in a large corporation. Yeah, like I would say in the shogunate you'd have like Kashira, who would be dealing with your band. Yeah, like a hatamoto working in the finance magistrate's office reports to the finance magistrate. Yeah, or like if you're like part of a guard group, like you would report to the Kashira of the guard group and not like directly to a daimyo or a lord. So, going back to like this whole bit about Anglophone scholarship being kind of all encompassing, This leads to the question of what exactly is a samurai in Anglophone scholarship. So Vaporis actually has this bit in both this essay called The Samurai in Tokugawa Japan, which is in a larger collection of Tokugawa-related material, as well as his Samurai Encyclopedia. But just to quote at length, like, who were the samurai, particularly since the perquisites of rank, 2 swords, and a family and a surname, Yoji Taito, were granted to some villagers and townsmen? We might consider 3 definitions. The first covers all people considered samurai in the contemporary Tokugawa context. Such a definition would include ronin, who, despite the lack of formal attachment to a lord and stipend, often displayed the symbols of the status group. This definition would also include Confucian scholars, jusha, and physicians attached to a daimyo, even though they might not serve a daimyo permanently. The second definition stresses the importance of a formal relationship between a retainer and overlord that required the performance of service, not necessarily of the military kind, in return for a stipend. Confucian scholars, physicians, privileged merchants, and artisans could also be included under this rubric. A third definition, and the one that is perhaps most widely accepted, limits membership in the samurai status group to those whose income was paid for by an overlord in return for military service obligations. Such a definition would exclude ancillary groups such as those listed in the second definition above. Funnily enough, I believe Vaporis uses the second definition for his Samurai Encyclopedia versus the third definition that he believes is the most widely accepted. So, like, what we're talking about here is kind of these blurred lines now. So we're saying, who are these samurai? In Anglophone scholarship, there's kind of like this fuzziness around, like, what do we consider a samurai? Like, after all, in this first part of this, the first part of this quote, we have the perquisites of rank, 2 swords and a surname, and they were actually granted to villagers and townsmen. So what are they? I like to call them like commoner plus. They're basically like commoners with extra privileges, essentially. So these people who are otherwise be in the commoner status group, so like peasant, artisan, merchant, etc., like, they could get a lot of the benefits of being a samurai. Like, and that could happen by like the purchasing of those privileges, or just being granted those privileges by prominent merchant, village officials, merchants, etc. Like, as the Edo period went on and into the later Edo period, you would have like prominent merchant families buying these privileges and just sometimes just straight up becoming like low-level samurai. For example, like Sakamoto Ryoma's ancestors, the Meiji Restoration figure, like, became like Goshi or rural samurai in Tosa by purchasing that status, even as like the other branches of his family still were merchants. What else do we have? Like official appointments by the daimyo and the shogunate. So a particular example might be a certain miso family that we will cover a little bit as a more specific example in Sendai. And like, who else? Even servants or specialists are actually just hired into samurai households or government as servants, could actually be like considered like samurai for the time that they're in service. I read an interview once with a surviving former samurai who said something like, you could buy status as a domain retainer, but above Goshi, and you actually have to do a job. True. Yeah. So one of the more interesting things about that is many of the official positions that actually paid extra in a given like shogunate or daimyo retainer band were in many cases reserved for higher level samurai. There are certain ways around that. So there's the concept of tashidaka in the shogunate, and probably in daimyo domains as well, where they would temporarily lord's administration would temporarily increase your status so that your status was sufficient for the job that you were being hired for. But there was a strict association between those higher level positions and your status within the hierarchy. So if you were getting, like, you were a lower level samurai, if you were a Goshi, for example, in Tosa, like, you were functionally barred from a lot of the better paying samurai jobs. And that status, that stipend and low level status didn't always support you in a way that was sustainable. And, you know, the result was a lot of eventual selling of those privileges. And, you know, this is actually a good segue into the other half of this fuzzy line that I'm talking about, which is samurai minus, or kind of where you're technically a bushi, but like your ability to actually do anything, or like your actual like practical day-to-day status isn't really as great as one would expect. So I'm talking about so-called lower samurai, so those without audience privileges, so like the gokinin in the shogunate, aforementioned goshi that we were discussing before. We talk about unemployed samurai. So, you know, there were far more samurai in these retainer bands than actual like samurai jobs. So like, you know, being an official, being a guard, etc., like actually doing something in your status. So people who don't have these statuses often end up in things like the like, for example, this Kobushin Gumi, which was a so-called reserve force for lower level samurai in the Tokugawa shogunate. You're basically there and you didn't do anything. In fact, sometimes you would even, later in the period, you would actually have to pay a fee back to the shogunate for being unemployed. It's basically like an unemployment tax against your stipend. And, you know, top of this, like, if you're a lower level samurai, like, you probably have a low stipend. And sure, like, it's free money, but if you aren't given the ability to get a better job, or you don't have like these other things, like any privileges other than this low stipend, then you're kind of in a bind. So yeah. And, you know, furthermore, like, if you're a lower level samurai, you may not even actually be a hereditary lower level samurai. So, and this is something I actually learned relatively recently, that, you know, some of the lower level Tokugawa gokinin, so these are basically lower level samurai who don't have like the audience privileges, they have low stipends, etc. A number of them were so-called single generation, or Ishidai Kakai. And their status was not hereditary. So when that type of gokinin passed along, their position would actually be opened up to an interview process. And that interview process, like, doesn't not necessarily mean that your heir, like your oldest son or whatever, would actually be able to inherit that position. It would be a factor, but it wouldn't be a deciding factor. So, yeah, so these are kind of like some of the blurry lines I'm talking about. And, well, moving on, like, what does that mean? What are we getting out of samurai status here that we're kind of talking about this stuff? So, as Vaporus mentioned, like, this is, let's see here, we've got the Myoji Taito, which is kind of like the combination of both being able to have a family name. So, names are a little complex in the Tokugawa period, but usually what we're referring to here is like a name, like a family name that you can use in public, rather than just like a personal family name that you keep like within the family or something similar. But, you know, so being able to use this name in public was an important status symbol. And on top of that, for example, carrying the daisho, which is having two swords at once, the katana and wakizashi, was also a major status system. No other like group was allowed to have two swords at once. It is a bit of a misconception that like commoners in general were unarmed. You were in a number of circumstances allowed to have a short sword of some kind, but only samurai or people with the specific privilege of carrying the daisho were allowed to have it. So on top of that, like, the stipend, basically the free money or grant of money from daimyo or the shogunate to a specific person. Like, that kind of privilege was often granted in addition to things like the myoji taito. And finally, like, if you were in a, like, for example, you were a servant and you joined a household of a samurai in order to, like, work as, say, a valet or chugen, like, you were subject to Bushi law, not commoner law, while in service. And now, is this a privilege? I think, it kind of is to some degree. Like, if you get in a scuffle with, like, a commoner or something like that, you would be, I believe you would end up, like, having to answer to Bushi officials and not, like, commoner officials. Like, these status groups are treated differently under the law. So, one thing that I'm not mentioning in here as a privilege is, like, the audience privilege. So, like, higher level samurai, for example, have that privilege of meeting or having an audience with their lord. I'm not putting it in here because the sources that I'm looking at don't ever say whether or not this was ever granted. But if you kind of look at the types of privileges that are granted, they're relatively, like, low level, I guess. Like, just the perquisites of lower level samurai are the things that are being granted. So something that is, like, reserved for a higher level isn't really being provided here. I think you could speculate that people who are appointed to special positions might have, like, that audience privilege, but I don't have any sources saying that. So it really is just speculation. So, like, what are disadvantages for this? Right? I actually kind of struggle to think, like, if there are really any disadvantages in this case, because by the end of the Edo period, like, there's quite a brisk I guess trade and opportunities of trying and, like, attempts to get this status. Like, quite a number of merchants and commoners, like, ended up kind of gaining these privileges. And one can ask, like, if so many people were attempting to get this, were there any significant disadvantages for this? So what I could think of maybe was that, these privileges or statuses could only were only extended during service. So if you were a servant joining a Bushi household, like, your ability to carry a sword and have a name, be subject to Bushi law, that was only things where that only happens while you're in service. So, like, if you join the household for 2 years, for example, like, you'd only have that status for 2 years, and then once you were done, you became a commoner again, essentially, and you only had, like, that brief period of time. Other disadvantage might be that you might be subjected to Bushi law versus commoner law, but Bushi law might have certain drawbacks. Like, you might be required to commit seppuku if you did something that, like, to follow on Riverside Wing's comment, would a commoner intentionally buy enough status to access a particular job? Would that even be possible? I'm not sure if it's, like, buying a particular status. So I think the closest thing I can think of for that is when you're certain merchants who got certain merchants would get like official monopolies or buying and pointing to such and such. Well, I would say that the buying in this case is probably more like a bribe. But yeah, merchants would often get like certain monopolies, like to export goods or being the official purveyor to like a daimyo family for certain goods like the miso that we're going to talk about. And part of that, like buying a commission in the Royal Army back in the Revolutionary War era. I mean, let me think about that. I suppose it's possible, but I personally don't know one way or the other. Like the research I was doing was not in depth enough for me to like say one way or the other. Like, what I would say is that like the merchant getting an official appointment, like possibly through bribery or just through being good at their job, you know, gets them that status rather than buying the status in order to get that, like monopoly position, for example. Also, like if we're looking at like the types of status that are being purchased, I don't think I added it to this presentation, but the single generation Gokinin, for example, as well as actually the inherited version, led to almost like a market for the acquisition of Gokinin status. So this was known as Gokinin Kabu or Gokinin shares. So it was almost like, you know, getting a share in a company, but instead of a company, it's like samurai status. So, you know, samurai families would essentially sell off the privilege of either being the heir to a hereditary Gokinin or like being given the option of like getting good word in for the subsequent interview for a single generation Gokinin. So like if we were taking it as a commission type thing, that's probably the closest I can think of for that. Or, you know, aforementioned buying of Goshi status in daimyo, in like daimyo domains. So like in Tosa, for example. But again, it's not, my research doesn't actually indicate doing that for the purpose of something else, like for a particular job. But that is kind of just a shortcoming on my end in terms of research. It's not saying definitively yes or no. So yeah, that was just a long-winded way of saying I don't know. Sorry. So, you know, I'm talking about like, you know, commoner plus, Bushi minus, all these privileges and disadvantages. So, you know, I think it kind of lends to like a open-ended question about comparing these two things. Like who is, like just as an example, like who's higher in the hierarchy? Like a low-ranked samurai versus like the servant of a more highly ranked samurai. Like, and these just kind of like comparisons between the two. So in Gary Loop's servants, shop hands, and laborers in Tokugawa, in the cities of Tokugawa, Japan, he kind of compares like an ashigaru, who is like a very low-ranked samurai, to the wakato, or a steward of like a high-end samurai family. I think low-ranked samurai is higher because a servant of a higher-ranked samurai is a rear baishin. I mean, I think that's true in the sense of the baishin as being a rear vassal, like if he's part of the retainer band. But I think in what Loop is talking about here, yeah, long history of baishin not getting respect. I think in this case, like he's talking about buke hokonin, who are like contract guys. I'm not sure if what you're talking about in terms of baishin being like hereditary hereditary rear vassals. In his case, he's talking about like contract folks. He kind of presents it in a kind of a mixed sense, in that like Ashigaru in his estimation often like lived in domestic servants' quarters, for example. Whereas like, you know, higher end Wakato, like high end like servants, and servants like porters and such. Yeah, so like he had in the book, he has like a whole like list of these guys. And that also includes like shugen as valets, but not shugen as the official like positions in a daimyo retainer band, where there's like the position of shugen, which would actually be filled by like an actual vassal. In this case, it's more like contract or casualized labor. Yeah, it's an open question in this case, because like if we're talking about like the highest end servant, he is a commoner technically, but while he's in service, he's treated like a bushi, and at the same time he's part of a higher end household, and you've got like this lowly samurai who is like usually frequently sleeping in domestic servants' quarters too, because he's low ranked enough in a retainer band to kind of be stuck in the same place. Who knows what would happen if one like insults the other, or vice versa? Like, it's kind of an open question, I think. I think Luke also kind of leaves it an open question. He's just kind of comparing the two, and he's not really positing the question in his book, like what would happen if the two came into conflict, I think. But I think it's an interesting question, and it's not one I'm necessarily equipped to answer either. I think a lot of unanswered questions is useful in kind of illuminating the fuzziness of these things. Because like, if we're talking about just a straight samurai like versus a commoner, like that samurai has quite a lot of privilege over that commoner. Yeah, I would think it would depend if the servant is wearing a daimyo's crest or other emblems, for one thing. Or like their lord, whoever that may be. Yeah. I mean, that's true. Like, if that, and a lot of these servants would be dressed in samurai livery. Like, they would be given uniforms and similar. So, yeah, so this, like, Wakato, who in this case is like a high ranked servant, they would have like that thing. Yeah. Because then a low ranked samurai stirring shit would be an attack on the servant's lord. Exactly. I think that's like the key here, is that just because you're a servant, like, your individual position is not necessarily the same as who you represent. So yeah, very good point. You know, I think that's kind of where I was getting at. Like, I guess one of the ways you can think about it is like, in the modern military, like, you have officers and non-commissioned officers, and the lowliest, freshest officer technically outranks the most seasoned non-commissioned officer. But if that fresh, like, lieutenant, like, uses his privilege to lord around like a non-commissioned officer, especially, let's say, like, that's the first sergeant for that, who is like in many ways a chief assistant to like this fresh lieutenant's like commanding officer. Like, that commanding officer, that lowly lieutenant, even if he's technically outranking the non-com, is in for a world of hurt if he throws around his privilege. So yeah, like, so even in the modern world, there's like certain fuzzy lines like that. Yeah. Yeah, the worst thing a second lieutenant can say to like a master sergeant is the phrase, "in my experience." Yes, and that second lieutenant's experience is solely like like officer candidate school of any sort. Yeah. Yeah, that master sergeant will have a certain amount of tact and then will chew him out thoroughly in private. Yeah, so yeah, it's like saying to someone who's been a soldier longer than the second lieutenant has been alive. Exactly. Exactly. There's an anecdote I read how the polite way that an officer, like a fresh officer's non-com, more experienced non-com might do something is that a second lieutenant might give some orders, and then his senior non-com might caveat on that and basically change the orders to make sense. So yeah, there's a lot of hierarchies that get subverted for very practical reasons, especially when the interaction of the hierarchy becomes a little ambiguous. So, you know, a lot of fuzziness, a lot of like maybe then blah blah blahs. We can talk about a couple of examples. So let's here's an example of like a peasant presenting as a samurai. So in this case, like we're actually talking about like a village official. So in this case, this was an incident in Howell's Geographies of Identity in 19th century Japan, and this was in 1836 in Nanbu domain. And so we had a present scribe of an intendant, like a village intendant. He was sent to Mito to deal with an issue, and that issue was apparently, quote, the aftermath of a vendetta exacted by a local youth. But anyway, when this peasant scribe was sent to Mito, he was permitted to wear 2 swords. He was using a surname, and basically he was presenting himself as a samurai. And this was because like the duty he was doing was suitable for an official, but he's representing his domain. So that person who represents the domain has to present as a samurai. So basically he's a samurai for the time when he's leaving Nanbu to go to Mito to deal with this situation and then come back. So like so we're not talking about buying privilege here. He was basically just temporarily given the status. And even then, it's like a complete contrast to like this idea that there were these firm dividing lines between like samurai and like commoners. Oh, and like for another example, we have jusha. So one of the ironic things is that Vaporis mentions jusha in his blurb about who's a samurai, who's not, and in neither of the works where he references or that quote comes from, he doesn't actually talk about what Confucian scholars were or what they did. In this case, this bit comes from Kate Wildman Nakai's Shogunal Politics, Arai Hakuseki, and the Premises of Tokugawa Rule. So Arai Hakuseki was a jusha. He was a Confucian scholar who actually was a jusha for like 2 Tokugawa shogun. And these scholars were, hired by like daimyo and samurai households to be tutors and advisors. Sometimes they would like manage libraries, that sort of thing. This position was not necessarily inherited. In a lot of cases, there are some families that became like hereditary scholar families, but in many instances, these people were hired on for like temporary contracts or similar. In a lot of cases, they may actually just be samurai simus, but commoners were also considered and occasionally added in. These people were given many of the trappings of bushidom, so like stipends, etc., but it was frequently on the lower end. In-house scholar sounds like a pretty good get. Yeah, I think it would be too. in a lot of cases, like you're kind of, in some cases, like you're teaching, like the daimyo's heirs, but it's in a very Confucian manner where you're basically like teaching calligraphy, teaching the classics, and it's not always like lecturing. If I remember correctly, a lot of it is just getting the student to memorize and recite the classics rote. And then after you get the mastery of it, you can then kind of like, think about it, that sort of thing. But yeah, there were other things that they did, but one of the things that like scholars tried to do, but weren't always available, is they wanted to kind of like be advisors or like try to influence like the daimyo or like the hierarchy, and that kind of didn't happen, at least from my reading and the little reading that I did in Nakai's work. Like, they were not in a position, because they were relatively low ranked, they're not really in a position to have that much influence. I presume Arai Hakuseki had a bit more because he had a direct ear to Tokugawa shoguns, but I did not necessarily read this book all the way. I was trying to find information on jusha, so I did not read the whole book. But that should probably go on my list. And one more example of these sort of things. We're going to talk about the purveyors of miso for the Date clan. So the Makabeya family, in the early Edo period, at the behest of Date Masamune, became the official miso and salt purveyors of the Date family. They basically like made miso for the Date retainer band because miso is a great ration. They also dealt with salt because salt is quite necessary for the production of miso and just like preserving foods in general. This family was given a stipend and the right to a samurai family name, which is Furuki. And yeah, like they are an example of like merchants being given an appointment and then being essentially granted all the trappings of samurai status in return. And this comes from Nairi Pakalian's Friday Night History Sendai Miso. It's in 2021. And thank you for that reference, because I could not find an example otherwise. So yeah, like, so that's mostly it on my end. Here is the list of sources that I picked for this. It was a little difficult because I could not find a direct source that talked about this. I mean, obviously, like, if there was a source that was directly talking about this, it would be less interesting to make a presentation about it. But it's kind of interesting because most of these works, like the things I'm talking about are somewhat tangential to what their overall thesis is. Although it's funny because I think in a lot of ways, like, so Howell's Geographies of Identity in 19th Century Japan actually talks a lot about status and how status governed like the Tokugawa system in general. Because like every group has a status, every like subgroup, so like occupations had a particular type of status, and those occupational groups are regulated according to that status. So like it's part of a whole body of work that is based around the notion of rule by status. So something that John W. Hall proposed back in the 70s, and that line of inquiry has like come through to the point where like that is a major component of the new Cambridge History of Japan's volume on early modern Japan. Not coincidentally, it's edited by Howell himself. So, but yeah, so like Yeah, I think that's about it for me here. Um, anyone has any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them as best I can. I will admit that I don't think this is one of my stronger presentations, but at the same time, it's like I think if I didn't actually make the presentation now, I'd never actually finish it. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, like trying to research this was an interesting exercise in like going around the periphery and also kind of beating my head against some things. But I think in the end it was worth doing.